Bom dia a todos. Good morning, everyone. We were just waiting for a few more people to come. We have about 70 people already, so this is an official good morning, everyone. Bom dia a todos, especially Tom Fox, because it's very early where he is. It's 7:30 in the morning there. Thank you so much. A todos aqui no Brasil, novamente, o meu bom dia oficial. Vou falar só umas regrinhas em português para ficar mais fácil para todo mundo. Nós, nesse webinar, que é um live, que é um programa de entrevistas, tudo junto, temos um intérprete. I'm going to go into English. Tom, it's an incredible pleasure to have you here in Brazil. In Brazil right now. Have you noticed the difference in weather? I am very, very happy to have you. And those of you who have not met Tom, he was here in Brazil a couple of times. The last time was about 2 years, and he was an incredible success in an event of more than 300 people. He is literally the guy who wrote the book on compliance with his seminal volume book, the Compliance Handbook. This is it. This is the book that I'm talking about. This is the first volume. Now he wrote the second edition, and this is what we're celebrating here in Brazil. But in addition, Tom has authored 19 books on business leadership, compliance, ethics, corporate governance, including international bestsellers like Lessons Learned on Compliance and Ethics and Best Practices under the FCPA and Bribery Act, and many other award-winning series Fox on Compliance. Perhaps Tom's better known for his podcasts that I absolutely love and keep me close to the United States because I really miss it and all of the news and everything that is going on there. He leads a discussion on compliance with his award-winning blog and is the voice of compliance, having founded the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. You will then see later on, we'll give you his email address for you to be in touch with him. But it's an incredible honor. Tom, I consider you, I know that your name is the Compliance Evangelist, but to me, you're the person who knows the most about compliance. You inspire me and inspire everyone here in Brazil. So be very welcome. But before you start, I just wanted to introduce my partners, my dear friends, Cynthia and Maida. Cynthia is the head and vice president of CRA's risk investigations in practice in Brazil. She's an attorney by trade. She was barred in Washington, D.C., and has been working with consulting for the past 15 years. We're happy to have her in Brazil. And prior to leading CRA business in Brazil, Cynthia worked at several consulting firms, the World Bank, and the Attorney General's office in Washington, D.C. She's recognized by the GIR directory as a leading investigator in her field and has worked on some of the largest investigations in Brazil. I have had the pleasure to work with her in many projects, and it was delightful. And then Cynthia will introduce Maida, who's also a very dear friend.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you for having me. Tom, it's an honor to be in this panel with you. I hold you in very high regard. So I'm excited for this event. I'm also very happy to be here with my colleague, Maida Martella. She is a reference in the financial sector compliance field. She's an attorney by training. has an MBA from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and currently leads Banco Rendimento's corporate compliance program. She's one of very few people that has a tremendous amount of common sense when it comes to compliance. So it really is an honor to be here with her, Isabel, and Tom.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'll make my words yours because it's also an honor to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Isabel and Tom. It's such a pleasure to be in the same panel as you guys. And I have the pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Isabel, who is the head of the compliance investigation and white collar practice of Azevedo Sete lawyer of practice. Isabel is considered by legal directors as a pioneer of compliance and internal investigations in Brazil. For years, she has been ranked #1 lawyer in Latin America in the practice of anti-corruption and compliance by LACA, as well as Latin lawyer by Chambers Latin America Band 1, and foreign expert for USA by Chambers Global. She was also included in the list of the 100 best investigators in the world by the Global Investigations Review. And it's a pleasure to be with you all here. So Isabel, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Maida. You know, I'll never forget that we worked in an investigation in Rio de Janeiro for weeks, every day, getting up, having breakfast together, lunch and dinner, and working so hard. And the client was very happy. And I have to say that in this market, when we work together with people in investigations, it makes us friends for life, right?
It does indeed.
Amazing. So Tom, the floor is all yours. Really, tell us everything about this incredible book that it's already in 2nd edition, please.
So first of all, let me thank Isabel and Cynthia for sponsoring this, Anita for being on the panel with us. It's really my joy to be with you all today. And I'm going to have a little pride to show you the new book. The first book was blue. The 2nd edition is maroon. So I hope that you will be able to get a copy. We're going to talk about the book. I'm going to give a few opening remarks about the book, but I really want to leave as much time as I can for your questions. And I know that's what you'd really like to focus on is your areas of inquiry. But as Isabel said, I'm the compliance evangelist. And the reason I took that name is in ancient Greek, an evangelist was the bringer of the good news. And I believe compliance is the good news, that it's good news for businesses. And frankly, it's good news for the world. There is $3 trillion lost annually to the global scourges of bribery and corruption. And when I came into the compliance field quite by accident about 15 years ago, I found that this was a corporate discipline that I could embrace as a lawyer with passion to help fight this international scourge. But more than simply helping to fight this international scourge of bribery and corruption, I believe that compliance, effective compliance, leads to more efficient business processes, which leads to greater profitability. So I advocate that compliance can actually improve a company's bottom line. It can improve its return on investment. And since that's the reason corporations exist, at least one of the reasons is to make money, nothing wrong there from my perspective, that it really gives me a way to passionately talk about a business process that can be used by every company and help fight this international scourge. So I really am very passionate about the discipline of compliance, and I applaud every one of you for having that same passion. I feel like every day, anything I do to help move the ball forward, if it's 1 inch, if it's 1 foot, if it's 1 yard, if it's 1 meter, if it's 1 click, I have succeeded and moved and helped in this fight. So as you can tell, I'm very passionate about compliance. The reason I updated this book is really for 2 reasons. Number one, the first book was released in the summer of 2018. And in 2019, the Department of Justice had major announcements about compliance. They had the U.S. Department of Treasury had major announcements about compliance, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So I needed to update to incorporate those announcements. Number two was that these announcements really changed the focus of compliance, really away from legal driven to data driven, but more importantly, business process driven. And then the third reason is really for my colleagues in Brazil and across the world outside the United States. My first book really focused on the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the U.S. compliance response to that law. But since that time, literally with Brazil leading the way with the Clean Companies Act, we've had many other countries enact anti-corruption laws, and I needed to make the book more user-friendly for the entire world, not simply the United States. So you will see some references to the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but I tried to remove as many of those as I could because I want this book to be used to be a resource for you all, as we say in Texas, for everyone across the world. And so that was the third reason that I felt like I needed to update this book. I've tried to make this book as user-friendly and as practical as possible. I'm a lawyer by professional training, and I try at all times not to write or talk like a lawyer. And you will see no citations. You will see no sort of deep dive legal references. You will see no extended footnotes. What you will see is a practical guide. The book is designed, each chapter is 20 to 25 separate entries. After each entry, I give 3 key takeaways. So very biblical, 12 chapters. You can read one a month. Do not sit down and try to read the entire book cover to cover, but it's each chapter is a specific part of compliance so that you can look at third parties, you can look at investigations, you can look at innovation, you can look at internal controls, you can look at a wide variety of compliance areas with, like I said, each entry has 3 key takeaways. One of the things I'm most proud about is I start the book with what I call 31 days to a more effective compliance program. And I can't remember how I came up with this idea, but my goal was to give every compliance practitioner in 1 month, and it's 31 days because it's always the month of January, 31 different topics that you can read each day, once again with 3 key takeaways, and then utilize that in your compliance program. Whether you're a 30-day newbie to compliance or you're a 10-year veteran. Each takeaway is something that is at relatively low cost, and so that you can incorporate that into your compliance program. So the book starts with 31 things you can do in 31 days to improve your compliance program. From there, I move to, as I said, a wide variety of other topics. I look at investigations, I look at third parties, I look at root cause analysis, I look at internal controls, but I also look at areas that you might not focus on as much. So for instance, what is the role of human resources in compliance? Well, I think that human resources is a key ally of compliance, because who has more touch points with an employee during the life cycle of an employee or employment relationship than HR? They touch them in the pre-interview process when a resume or other information might come in about a potential candidate. They touch them when they have an initial interview, a screening interview. They touch them when a candidate or pre-pandemic would come to the office for an interview. They touch them when a senior executive or person who that candidate may work for comes back for a second round of interviews. If that candidate is hired, they have a touch point on the onboarding process. If that candidate stays for more than a year, they'll have a touch point on an annual review or a discretionary bonus. So at each one of those touch points, human resources can say a word about our culture, about compliance, about this is the way we do business, this is the way we treat people, this is who we are and how we're going to move forward. And it can reinforce everything you as the compliance professional, all of your messaging as well. The role of the board of directors is becoming much more important. So I have a chapter on the boards of directors. How does the board oversee and manage compliance? A board's role is very different than your role as the compliance professional, but it's very different than the role of senior management. The board of directors should not be involved in the day-to-day operations of compliance, but they do have a role in overseeing risk management in your company. They may set the risk tolerance your company is willing to take, and they need to be educated on their role. I often present to boards on how does a board do their role in compliance. Well, you may need to do the same thing, not simply how do we comply with the Clean Companies Act, but how do we comply with our role? So it can be a very helpful book in those. The root cause analysis is something that's new, and you need to incorporate a root cause analysis if you are involved in an incident going forward. I'd like to end my remarks by talking about third parties. Third parties, and this will be, I have the statistics in the United States, so I will give you the US view. Over 90% of all FCPA anti-corruption enforcement actions involve third parties. That was 2020. That's the FCPA has now been enforced over 40 years, and it's still the largest. So that means it's the highest risk. That means you have to have the highest risk management strategy. And so as part of this event, I have created a white paper on the 5 steps or the life cycle of risk management for third parties. And that's going to be made available to all the attendees of this event. And it's a straightforward process, but it will give you a framework for you to think about how you can best manage the risk of third parties in your compliance program. So I'm very excited about that giveaway, and I hope that it will find it helpful because, once again, at least in the United States, third parties are still the highest risk. So if you can manage that risk, then perhaps you can move to some of the others. Isabel, we're kind of coming up on the amount of time I wanted to take, and I really wanted to spend the rest of the time answering questions of our audience. So could I turn it back over to you to start the Q&A process?
Absolutely, Tom. Thank you so much. It's been very interesting. And I made notes here of the most important points, and I have many questions myself, but I really want to hear from our audience, and that's why I'm going to go into Portuguese just for 1 second. Por favor, mandem as suas perguntas para o chat, se possível já em inglês, ok? E como nós dissemos no começo do nosso programa hoje, o Tom vai autografar um livro e enviar para uma das pessoas que vai ser sorteada, que mandaram perguntas. Então, mandem as suas perguntas. Por favor, a Tatiana, que está nos assessorando do Azevedo 7, vai fazer um sorteio pegando os nomes das pessoas, e aí o Tom vai autografar em nome de quem é sorteado. De qualquer forma, ele também, como acabou de dizer, vai passar um white paper que é super importante sobre justamente o third party risk, e a gente ia também sortear entre os participantes, mas eu entendi corretamente. If I understood correctly, Tom, the white paper will go to all of the attendees, right? Good. So that is his generosity, and that's why he is the evangelist, right? Spreading the word. It's a fabulous white paper. So without further ado, do we have a first question? If not, I will ask my first question. Okay, while you get organized. No, Rogéria Jeremek has asked the first question. I cannot jump ahead of you, Rogéria. Tom, Rogéria is LATAM Airlines Chief Compliance Officer, an extremely experienced compliance officer. She's a lawyer also. She is like one of the pioneers of compliance in Brazil. She is asking you how to adapt the compliance program to ESG necessities. Thank you, Rogéria.
Sure. And here's ESG is one of the most used terms in 2021. And I want everyone in compliance to understand that I think compliance should take the lead in running ESG. And the reason I think so is twofold. Number one, with the exception of perhaps environmental, and I'll leave that to the side, but I know Isabel has knowledge around environmental matters and her firm does as well, so she may jump in. But when it comes to sustainability or social and governance, that's exactly what compliance does. We do that every day. I spoke about the board of directors. That's governance. That's part of your ESG. Sustainability, do you have an investigative process? I hope you do. Does that investigative process include a hotline? Does it include reporting up to the compliance professionals who then, as Cynthia and Isabel do, may do an investigation? And does the investigation lead to a result? Could that result be a discipline of an employee, or could that result be the remediation of a control that perhaps needed enhancement? Well, that is part of the S, exactly. So you're already doing ESG. Now, when it comes to environmental, you have to have a framework to comply with environmental laws, just as you do anti-corruption laws. So the framework of compliance, which it's really 8 steps. It is setting your message. Number 1, tone at the top. Number 2, policies and procedures to implement that message. Assessing the risks your corporation have. What do those risks be? An environmental issue or a corruption issue. Number 5, training on your policies and procedures. Number 6, incentivizing or employees to follow your policies and procedures or disciplining them if not. 7 is ongoing monitoring to make sure you're in compliance with your own policies and procedures. And then the last step, number 8, is enhancing your compliance program. Now, those 8 steps you're not going to find in the U.S. Department of Justice or any other country, say, but those 8 steps are common to every compliance program. And those are things that you as compliance professionals do every day. And so environmental law may not be your area of specialty, but you can set up the framework and structure for compliance with that law in conjunction with an environmental lawyer or an environmental expert. So I think compliance is uniquely suited because of what we already do. Number 2, you're already doing compliance. You're already doing ESG. And I gave a couple of instances, but now let me go to, you've completed your investigation and you have to decide, what are we going to do about these employees who either violated our policies and procedures or were close to it and exploited a loophole? You have to be fair and you have to do it with justice. And as we would say in the United States, institutional fairness and institutional justice. You have to treat everyone the same. If and this example will ring true, I think, to you all as a chief compliance officer in my last corporate position. we fired employees in Brazil for cheating on their expense account. 2 weeks later, the top salesman in America was caught cheating on his expense account. And I said, if we don't fire this guy after having fired these Brazilian employees, we'll have zero credibility. So you have to treat everyone fairly, literally across the globe. But that's exactly what you do now as a compliance officer. So I think you all are uniquely suited to leading the ESG effort, and that's going to become more important. It's only going to become more important. I know I talked a lot on that, but it's a topic on a lot of people's minds. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Tom. We have another question from the audience here regarding the use of monitoring and artificial intelligence. What are your thoughts on the use of artificial intelligence in monitoring compliance programs?
Let me start with data, because the biggest change to compliance programs during the pandemic has been the increased reliance on data. Isabel spoke about, I think she said she and Cynthia went to Rio de Janeiro for an investigation. We couldn't do that for the last 18 months. We couldn't travel to go do an investigation. So that meant your investigation had to be largely data driven. Part of that data is going to be emails and other documents that lawyers are very comfortable with. Part of that data is going to be numbers. And I won't speak for you as a lawyer, but I will speak for me as a lawyer. I didn't learn about data. I didn't learn about numbers. I can barely add 2 and 2. So I have to rely on other people for those skills. But so that's number one, data's become more important. I mentioned the US Department of Justice had a major announcement after my first book came out. That was the update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs released June 1, 2020. In that document, they specified that the compliance function must have access to all data across an organization, not simply compliance data, but all data, and that the compliance function had to use that data to, number one, monitor their compliance program and then upgrade or enhance their compliance program. Okay, now we get to the artificial intelligence. What is artificial intelligence? It is using data to build out a more robust response. So machine learning allows a machine to gather information and then make suggestions. That's the artificial intelligence part. Your role, and everyone on this webinar's role, is you have to interpret that. You may get a suggestion or you may get a recommendation from an artificial intelligence AI compliance tool, but you still have to interpret that, and you have to decide if it fits within your risk management profile. So there will be an increased use of data. There will be an increased use of machine learning, but this is not unique to compliance. Every business discipline and every business process will be doing this. And we as, and I'll speak for myself again, as lawyers, I don't know about your legal training, but as my legal training, we didn't learn anything about that, but we're going to have to either learn it or bring in experts who can help us interpret that, whether that's a data scientist or an AI specialist. But data is going to become more important, whether it's simply you as the compliance officer interpreting the data, or if you have a machine learning tool as well.
Thank you, Tom. We also have 2 questions here from the audience regarding the pandemic, so I'm gonna try to merge them both so we can address them all. So how do you see internal investigations and compliance awareness in light of the COVID restrictions, especially when it comes to social distancing and home office? And what are the first 3 challenges or priorities you would point out that compliance officers will face because of the instability and changes in the business models and capacity to intervene and monitoring?
Maíra, can you please tell us who sent these?
Yes, of course. So these
please?
questions came from Luciano Santos and Dievre Frederick. Great questions, guys. Thank you.
Well, hello, Luciano. Luciana. I mentioned the investigative example that Isabel and Cynthia had done, where they actually went to Rio de Janeiro. Well, now you can't do that. Or if you may be under great travel restrictions and you can do part of it, you're going to have to rely much more closely on the data and reviewing information that doesn't require you to leave your office or perhaps even your home. So that's sort of point one. In terms of, let me just add, in addition to the question, beyond the monitoring, your ongoing communications. How can you keep your employees aware of compliance, keep compliance front of mind when they're working from home, when they're obviously are on Zoom calls a lot of the day? That requires you to think about a compliance communications that may be a little bit different. It's not wagging your finger and say, don't do this. It's perhaps giving some case studies or real world examples, using animation, using professional actors to tell a short 3-minute, 1-minute story about compliance. Something to, I interviewed someone yesterday and they called it an espresso shot of compliance. It's very short yet very powerful. And so you need to have a communication strategy around COVID as well. One of the things, the second part of the Department of Justice's evaluation I mentioned that came, evaluation of corporate compliance programs that came out in June 2020, one of the other changes was in risk assessments. And they said where we used to do a major risk assessment perhaps every year, but maybe every 2 or 3 years, now you have to do a risk assessment when your risks change. Well, what changed more in the working world during the pandemic then? Working from home. That was the biggest change, I think, across the globe. And now the change is perhaps returning to the office. What's your risks on both of those? Certainly risks change when employees work from home. The question of how you monitor them. What are they doing? Are they seeing competitors? Are they talking to the competitors? Do they have a second job now that you don't know about because they have another computer at home that you don't have access to? All of those risks changed when employees started working from home. Well, now, if they're returning to the office, what risks do you have? Obviously, you have a health risk. There's a very robust debate in the United States about whether companies will or even can require vaccines. What's the role of compliance in that? Well, I talked about institutional justice and institutional fairness. If you have a policy, it has to apply to everyone, whether they're the top salesman or the 30-day newbie. So you have to assess your risks. And then the monitoring, that's become even more critical. So I'm sort of drawing a straight line here from your risk assessment to your monitoring to your continuous improvement. That's really the third change the Department of Justice brought forward. They see that now as a straight line. So what are your risks? Assess your risks as they change, then put in a risk monitoring program, obviously policies and procedures and internal controls. And then if you get information that says we need to increase our risk management strategy or we can decrease it, then you do so. But it's really changed. It really, to me, is now one line from risk assessment to monitoring to continuous improvement.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pity that we don't have the whole day today to talk to you. We have so many questions coming up, and I want to remind everyone that we're going to, Tom is going to generously autograph the book and send it to Brazil. By the way, many people asking, where can we buy this fabulous work? And do the Brazilians have a special discount, Tom?
Yes, we do for the attendees on this webinar. First of all, it's available at lexisnexis.com/Fox. That's FOX. And I'm going to put the, I'm not sure I can find the discount code while we're on this webinar, but I will certainly provide it to Isabel. You can get 20% off. I will put the link in the chat function as we're going along. But I do hope that you'll take the advantage. If you want this book, you'll take advantage of this discount. A couple of other things about the book. It is obviously written with the compliance professional in mind, but it's also written for the business executive, because I talk a lot about some broader concepts that I think the business executive needs to understand about compliance. Certainly, it's the nuts and bolts of how to design, create, and implement a best practices compliance program. But I also talk about communication strategies. I talk about innovation in compliance. I talk about where compliance might be 5 or 10 years down the road. So there's lots of business processes that if you want to give a gift to your senior executives, this would be the book.
Great. That is a great Christmas gift, right? But it is so true, Tom. My partner, my dear partner, Glaucia Fajita, who's here, just used some of your quotes in a opinion that she gave to a client, where the words that you use are perfect for business people. True. My next question comes from João Elecki. Tom, João Elecki was the Chief Compliance Officer of Petrobras. I think you have heard of Petrobras during some turmoil. He was there. He was the Chief Compliance. He now has a very simple question to you. First of all, he's thanking you for being with us here in Brazil. And he says, and I will quote him, "As you may know, the fight against corruption has been slowed down in Brazil. This occurs despite the fact that we already have laws, all legal grounds, mechanisms, private sector buy-in, etc. Do you believe that collective actions and the voice of civil society are enough to make authorities to resume the white fight against corruption?" Thank you, João.
So I just put the book site in the chat, and I'll get the discount code and provide it to Isabel. So that's a great question. That's actually a topic of debate in the United States about Brazil, as well as I know it's a topic of debate within your community. But let me maybe look at it in a little different perspective. There have been times of more enforcement, and there have been times of less enforcement. But if you want to do business on the international stage, you have to have a compliance program. If you're a Brazilian company and you want to have a US subsidiary, if you want to do business in the United States, you're going to have a compliance program. If you're a Brazilian company and you want to do business in the North Sea with the United Kingdom or Norway, you have to have a compliance program. If you want to do business literally anywhere in the world, you're going to have a compliance program. But it's not simply corporations to corporations. If you want to access capital markets, if you want access to the United States stock exchanges, if you want access to the United Kingdom stock exchanges, if you want access to the Singapore or Hong Kong stock exchanges, you have to have a compliance program. If you want access to capital in the form of bank loans, banks require compliance programs. If you want access to private equity investment, you're going to have a compliance program, because each of those entities that either are going to give you capital in the form of stock, in the form of a loan, or in the form of a private equity investment, they want their investment to succeed. And they see a best practices compliance program as not only a way to do that, but a reason to do that. If I, Tom Fox Energy Company, want to do business as a supplier, I may want to look at your compliance program. And you, as Petrobras or any Brazilian energy company, you certainly want to see my compliance program, because you don't want to have a supplier who doesn't know about compliance. So the biggest change I see coming worldwide around compliance is that this is going to be a business solution to a legal issue. The legal issue is the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, Brazilian Clean Companies Act, United Kingdom Bribery Act, the French setembro, whatever the law is, but we business people, we are driving compliance now. And that's going to be the biggest change. If you want to do business on the world stage, you're going to have a compliance program. On the enforcement stage, I understand, frustration in Brazil. I'm confident it will change again, but I'm not obviously as close to the scene as you guys. But I take great comfort that it's now businesses driving compliance. And I give you this example. Once again, it comes from America, but I think it really drives home the point. I grew up in Houston, Texas, which we call arrogantly the energy capital of the world. What changed in Houston with energy companies after robust enforcement was they all put compliance programs in place. But they said to every supplier, if you want to do business with us, you have to have a compliance program. And I had a client who's a $15 million software company that had one piece of software that did something downhole that gave some measurement. And I kept telling these guys, if you don't have a compliance program, no one will touch you. And I finally convinced them to let me put a compliance program in. 2 weeks later, a major energy company came in and said, we want to make an investment in your company. We want to see two things, your product and your compliance program. And that to me drove home the message that even a $15 million company with one piece of software must have a compliance program if you want to compete on the world stage. So it's a long-winded way of saying that it's people like us and the people we work for that I think are really driving compliance now.
Great, thanks, Tom. Another question here that we have is from Orfeu Campos from Porto Seguro, one of the largest insurance companies here in Brazil. He wants to understand, in your view, what do you understand the board's role in practical terms, in terms of monitoring compliance within an organization? What do you see the role of the board?
Once again, the board's role is oversight, and that does not mean sort of day-to-day management. So I think the best practice is to have a board committee dedicated to compliance, separate and apart even from the audit committee, because audit focuses more generally on financial. And you have to educate the board. The board will have to test certain areas to see whether the compliance program is functioning. So here's where the risk assessment is critical for the board. The board may want to take the company's top 5 risks it assessed for itself and ask you as the compliance officer, show us your program for managing this risk, whether it's third parties, whether it's environmental, whether it's selling your sales model, whatever those risks, top 5 risks are. So the board needs to engage in oversight, but equally importantly, of its own risks. The best example I can give you once again comes from America. And then I grew up in a little town in Central Texas, and the next town over had the top ice cream creamery in Texas. It was called Bluebell Ice Cream. We used to take trips to go see it. Well, they got in trouble because they had a failure at their plant and several people died from ice cream food poisoning, as tragic as that is. And there was no discussion at the board level ever around food safety. And the US government said, your number one risk is food safety. Why weren't you talking about it in the board level? Well, if you're an international energy company, you're number one and you're doing business and you name the usual places, West Africa, Central Asia, Asia Pacific region, the government would say, why aren't you looking at your potential risks in those areas? So pharmaceutical, where's your highest risk? Is it in China? Is it somewhere else? So the key is to assess your risks and then have the board oversee the management of those risks. Now, you may have to educate your board as a compliance professional. You tell them, here's how you look at me, as odd as that may sound. But if you need to do that, do so that they can fulfill their obligation. Because if there's if the regulators come knocking and there's no evidence that the board has engaged in appropriate oversight, that could be a problem.
Thank you, Tom. Another question that we have is from Glaucia Ferreira. She says that companies in Brazil, Tom, usually do not like the idea of performing background checks on subcontractors, so the fourth parties. What is your opinion on background check of fourth parties? Like we talked about the third parties risk. Would you go to fourth and fifth parties as well to do background checks on your continuing monitoring process?
So the problem with that approach is the following. If that fourth party whose background you have not checked engages in bribery and corruption, even if you don't know about it, you're responsible for it. And the regulators, whether that's Brazilian regulators, United States regulators, United Kingdom regulators, they're going to look to the end using company. Now, I understand the difficulty in having the fourth, fifth, or even sixth or seventh subcontractor down the line. So what you have to do, or what I would suggest, is you have a direct relationship with your third party. You require your third party to perform an appropriate background check on their subcontractors. So you have a relationship with your third party. You make them do the background check on anyone they contract with for your business, and that they make that background check available to you for review.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Marielle Paiva, and I'm sorry I don't see her company right now. She's asking you, Tom, if there's any specific detail or aspect that you see that companies are overlooking regarding compliance. And I think that's the question I would like to hear from everybody, actually.
So the aspect I really see, Isabel, is twofold. One is that we are not really seeing compliance as a business process. It's seen as a legal response to a law we have to follow. And if we can maybe change the vision of it to a business process, then the business people will see it's to our advantage to engage in compliance. One, I talked about why I think it makes a company more profitable, but also I also talked about why compliance can be a business differentiator. If you're doing business in compliance with a robust compliance program, other companies are going to want to do business with you, most particularly on the international stage. So if you can make this sort of shift from this is just a legal response to a law, that this is a business process, or the subtitle of my book is Operationalizing, a guide to operationalizing your compliance program. That means pushing it down to the very front levels of your company. And that's where I think you can make a big difference.
Thank you, Tom.
Do we have time for one more?
I think we do. You know, we still have more than 80 people. So if you don't mind, we could spill over and stay a little more, 10 more minutes. Is that okay with you, Tom?
Sure.
Okay. And also, after we're finished, offer the book. Okay. Cynthia and then Maida, please.
Excellent. So, Tom, in your experience, what kind of mistakes do companies make when they're evaluating their compliance program and its effectiveness? This question is from Fabio Lima.
So I would say the mistakes are, number one, you don't really think about your internal controls enough. And that I believe internal controls are the backbone of your compliance program. So you need to see where are the gaps in your compliance program, your internal controls for your compliance program. And you do that by performing a gap analysis. I have a gap analysis form that I'm happy to share with our audience. I can send to Isabel, but it takes, there's a framework for internal controls called the Coso Framework. And the Coso Framework has 5 objectives, 17 principles, and 84 points of focus. Those points of focus are all areas that your compliance program needs to have. And what you can do is then you can map the way I've got it set up on the spreadsheet is the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program to those controls. What that gives you is it shows you where you have gaps. And then you can fix those gaps or see if there's other controls that can handle those gaps. So number one is understand where your internal controls have gaps. The second is around the data. And I know I've talked about this a long time, or several times rather, but do you have access to data as a compliance professional? Do you have access to the gift, travel, and entertainment spend? Do you have access to sales data? Do you have access to marketing data? Do you have access to charitable donations? Do you have access to HR? All of these things that you may not think are compliance that you need access to so that you don't have access to your data. And I guess the third thing might be taking a step back to the risk assessment. Your risks have changed. They have changed in the last 18 months. Have you assessed your risks in light of those changes? It doesn't mean you have to bring in 20 people to do a 6-week risk assessment. You may be able to do it from your desk, but have you looked at how your risks have changed? So I would say those are the top 3.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Oh, thank you, Tom. So on that note, how do you see that data privacy impact on doing background checks and due diligence when companies are not sharing critical information anymore due to data privacy laws around the world? And in that regards as well, in what measure do you see impact of social media in the compliance culture? Because it is kind of some data that you're going for when you're doing background checks to actually check information on social media, but also the other side of the coin would be people engaging in social media in a very strong and fast way, and sometimes it ends up destroying the company's reputation in seconds. So how would you combine those two? Those questions come from Juliana Bonilla and Renata Felizola Saez. Thank you, Tom.
Well, hello, Juliana. First of all, on the due diligence, there is always, and let me repeat that, always a way to do background due diligence. You do not have to depend on what another company may or may not give you. And let me give you 2 examples. We recently had a scandal where, I think this would translate to Brazil, a football coach, American football, not Brazilian football, was fired because he had been involved in a sexual harassment scandal at his prior university. But the scandal was beyond him because it said his new university didn't know about the scandal because of privacy laws around the settlement of the first sexual harassment claim. I have a good friend who does due diligence. That's her job. And I called her up and asked her, was this unusual that you couldn't get this document around the settlement of a sexual harassment claim? 30 minutes later, she emailed me a newspaper article about that first sexual harassment scandal that she literally found in 30 minutes. People who do due diligence or background investigations, they're very good. And it literally took her 30 minutes to find out what this second university couldn't find in months. That's number one. Number two is it's just spade work. It is digging. The second scandal, we had a television show, very popular television show. The host died, so they're going to bring in a new host. Well, the new host was hired, and within 2 weeks, a reporter found a podcast where he had made very disparaging remarks about women and other minorities. He was an Anglo. And what she did was she simply searched through every podcast he had ever been interviewed on. I mean, that's tedious work, but that's what you have to do if the role is so critical. And having the spokesman for your television show is perhaps the most critical role. So I've really come around to thinking you can always find out about someone's background. It just takes work. And of course, that means time and money. But if you're hiring a new CEO, if your business, the JV partner you're going to bring in, it's so critical for this project, it's so much money or for whatever reason, you have to spend the time and money to do a background investigation. But literally everything is somewhere. And the final point is, and this, the gentleman from Petrobras may understand this as well, in the energy industry, and once again, I grew up in that industry, everybody knows everybody. Your boss today, he may work for you tomorrow at another company. We all go to the same conferences. If you're in Dubai and you're Brazilian, you're probably going to be with other Brazilians socializing. Certainly, when I lived in Dubai, I was around other Americans. They worked for other companies, but I learned about, a lot of other companies. And we all have relationships with each other. And it is not uncommon for me to pick up the phone and call a compliance officer at another company and say, can you just sort of tell me off the record, should we hire this person? It's not going to go in a report. And the honesty level is really quite high. So because of the relationships within an industry, you're often able to find out things that may not appear in an employment file or the public record.
That's great, Tom. That was a very comprehensive answer. And Rodrigo had asked a question specifically on third party, Rodrigo Coimbra Moreno, on third party due diligence. And I think you answered it very broadly. So I'm going to go into a question that really talks to my heart always. And the last time that you were here, you had, it was a big show. This question comes from Kari Moldenhauer, and she's asking how compliance can as a tool to increase the profits of the companies, because that's the show that you gave in 2019 when you came and you had slides, surveys, statistics. So I think that is always a great question. Thank you, Tom.
So let me use one example, and actually we may have talked about that at the presentation, Isabel. A company, a major tech company that I will not name, but who has Internet Explorer, not Apple, they were going to look at the gift, travel, and entertainment spend. This was pre-pandemic in a high-risk business unit, high risk because they were selling to government officials. And they wanted to see if anyone was exceeding their allowable spend. And what they found was the following, that the amount of money spent on, it was gifts and entertainment, not travel, was sort of from A to Z. And the low point was A and the high point was Z. What happened at Z was when that high point was exceeded, there was actually very few contracts signed. So there's a point to which your entertainment and gift spend, there's a declining curve of its success. So what the company said was, you have to spend A, but you can't spend more than Z. And this did a couple of things. Number one, it cut down on the amount of their entertainment and gift spend because they weren't spending more than Z. But number two, it gave the salesman a metric by which they understood that once they reached that point of Z, they just moved on to the next customer because they knew there was very little chance of getting a contract. So they reduced their gifts and entertainment spend, but the most important thing is they decreased their sales cycle, because when they got to that Z, they just went to the next customer. And so that's a way that what started out as a compliance investigation turned up data that showed we can do business more efficiently and in compliance. So that's one example that comes to mind. But the great thing about compliance, in addition to fighting the worldwide scourge on corruption, is we are all only limited by our imagination. If you can think of it, you could probably do it.
That's true. That's true. We have one last question that I want to squeeze in about nonprofits. We have someone in our audience that works at a private nonprofit, a school, and his question is, what are your takeaways for nonprofits specifically when they think about compliance? Does this change in any way? What risks should they be managing? What should they be on the lookout for?
So let me use this question to answer one I didn't get to about social media. Nonprofits, in addition to the regular risks of for-profit corporations, have to manage their reputation. In large part, nonprofits exist because of their reputation, which is their promise to deliver whatever their service might be. If you as a nonprofit have a donor, or if you as a nonprofit have contractors who violate the very core of what your nonprofit's about, it can be very damaging. And the best example I can give to you that's in front of my mind is the governor of the state of New York recently, within the past 2 weeks, had to resign because of sexual harassment over a number of years. Very graphic, very bad mistreatment of whistleblowers. There were two major nonprofits in New York that were designed to help women who had been sexually harassed. And they were on, the governor was on their board of advisors because publicly he was so supportive of their positions. And when he resigned, it devastated these nonprofits because they had turns out, a serial sexual harasser and someone who went after women who whistleblew on it on their boards, and it's really cut back on their donations. They may not survive. So its reputation is even more important in the nonprofit world. And that now ties into the question I didn't get to about social media. What social media does is it doesn't change things. It simply amplifies the voice of whatever it is so that it's 10 or 15 times greater. Number one. Number two is that it gives like-minded people or people with the same issue a way to congregate together. So you have a voice that's amplified and you have other people of similar minds who can band together, and they can band together very quickly to bring a lot of pressure on a company.
Thank you, Tom. So I am absolutely sure that Tom will answer all of the questions that we send to him by email. And eventually we will get back to those of you who did not have your questions answered during the webinar. Right, Tom? Unfortunately, I think we have to end. I would like to stay the whole day with you, Tom. Please remind us again that we can get the book where? By Amazon? I want you to talk about it, please.
No, first of all, I found that gap analysis spreadsheet and I put it in the chat function for everyone.
Oh, that's great.
The book is not available on Amazon. It's available on LexisNexis, and it's lexisnexis.com/Fox. I put that link into the chat function as well. And I wasn't able to dig out the discount, but I'm going to find that, send that to Isabel and ask her to distribute to all the attendees. Hopefully you can capture the questions and send them to me, and I'll be able to respond to those. But Isabel, this has just been way too much fun. I think we should get together and do this again sooner rather than later.
I was going to say that we could have another program. Thank you so much, Tom, because you're such a great hit here in Brazil. Everyone wants to hear you. We broke all our records in terms of people who enrolled, so we definitely have to do it again. We'll set the date this year.
Can I say one more thing before we go?
Yes, please.
If you have a podcast or you want to start a podcast and you want to come on my podcast network, please email me. I'd love to have a Portuguese language podcast. I'd love to have a Brazilian person podcasting in English. I'm trying to get more podcasts on my network. So if podcasting is in your future, please contact me.
That's great. And it's a great opportunity, Tom. Well, I want to thank everyone who stayed a little bit longer. But first of all, I want to thank Tom and Cynthia. Thank you so much for your partnership always, as well as Maida. Maida, great to have you here. And also want to thank my marketing department, Tatiana Sintra and Jennifer Santos, who are always the best. Everything they organize comes out beautifully. And also our dear interpreter, Carlos Abelera, who did a fantastic job. I went into the room to listen to your voice in Portuguese. Thank you, Carlos. And to all of you, wait for the next one, right? Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Isabel. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Maida.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a great one.